John, what's your assessment on the battlefield picture right now?
So my assessment is this. If what President Zelensky said is accurate, upwards to 110,000 Russian soldiers in the Donbas region, what they're doing right now is they're probing all of the lines, 600 kilometers worth of defensive lines, looking for that one weak spot or those 2 or 3 weak spots. So what you're seeing is that most recent tactic that we discussed most recently in the Hill in Popros, what you're seeing is the infiltration of small units getting into the rear of Ukrainian lines, and then you see them consolidating behind the lines and disrupting communications, lines of communications. What we're seeing is that those dismounted soldiers are the ones that are getting in, causing the disruptions, but they're also looking for those areas of vulnerability, those areas of weakness, those areas that other troops can exploit. So Ukraine now is being forced to defend everything. And when you defend everything, you basically defend nothing. Okay, so the forces that are on the ground are doing exceptional work, and they're doing a lot of damage, with 1,000 casualties a day that they're inflicting upon the Russians. But if the Russians can continue to add 1,000 people to the battlefield every day, it's a zero-sum game. So they have to be looking for those exploitation forces. Where are those forces staged? Where are they set? Okay, where do the Russians think they're going to find a weakness to exploit? And they have to attack that. We call that interdiction. They have to go after the larger forces. They still have to pay attention to the interdicting forces, don't get me wrong. But they have to be looking for the forces that are going to exploit those gaps. And right now we're seeing, yes, what's described in many reports as breakthroughs in certain areas aren't necessarily breakthroughs, but they are gaps that the Russians have identified as for exploitation for a later date. And when that is to be determined how quickly they can get those forces there. Now, the other part that Russia is vulnerable to is moving. Anytime they move an exploitation force, Ukraine's been very effective with their drones in identifying and destroying them. So it's a cat and mouse game right now, and we're still at a zero-sum game.
And from past year, we heard about capture of Pokrovsk almost every day. Do you think it will be the same tactic for Zaporizhia region?
They'll try to do the same thing. Again, the tactic that the Russians like to use is they like to envelop towns. So what I mean by envelop, they identify the target, and then they try to surround that target from the right to the left, and then encircle it, and then, in a sense, trap the occupying forces inside. So that's the tactic that they've been using since day one is the envelopment or double envelopment. And I anticipate that that's what they're doing in that region too. Again, it's identifying where those exploitation forces are and defeating them before they arrive on the battlefield. And that's difficult. Don't get me wrong. The intelligence folks, the guys that are looking for the enemy forces, have got to identify them so that the larger assets, the artillery, the tomahawks, if they ever have tomahawks, or the storm shadows, can be effective against those forces when they mass in order to exploit what they perceive to be defensive weaknesses.
In recent days, EU leaders have been talking about the war possibly ending in the next few years, and we heard different numbers. The European Commission chief mentions 2026, while French President Emmanuel Macron actually points to 2027. Mark, what do you make of these timelines, and do they actually align with the reality on the ground?
Yes, Sofia, I think it's a great question because, look, political leaders may want to wage war in terms of concrete dates, be it 2026, 2027. The reality is on the ground is that we're at a stalemate. So it's difficult to determine exactly just how much of this can be moved in that 1 to 2 year time frame unless there are corresponding military measures coming from the West. And we just don't see those yet. John and I have often called for game changers. For instance, an air defense system it's more proactive to what Ukraine's needs are, not just in its cities to protect its civilians, but also in terms of protecting its forward forces along the front lines. That hasn't happened yet. We've talked about having a sky shield, if you will, that protects at least Western Ukraine from these, devastating ballistic missile and drone attacks. That hasn't happened yet. We haven't even seen a willingness on the part of NATO, especially countries like Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, Romania, that have had air and drone incursions into their own airspace. They're not even willing to shoot down these drones in Ukrainian airspace or Belarusian airspace if they're coming from that way before they even reach NATO's borders. So I think it's awfully optimistic of them to be talking about when this war might end. Maybe they're hopeful that there's an economic end date to this. But I think, as I mentioned earlier on the segment, I think that's a bit of fool's gold because, look, Putin is not in this alone. China has its own stakes in this and may, in different ways, indirectly support him above and beyond just oil purchases, which they may delay for a while because of the impending sanctions that have that wind down date or drop dead date, if you will, on November 21st. So I'm leery of it. I think it's optimistic thinking on their part. I know that John probably has some commentary here from a military standpoint, but to me, it's just a bit of fool's gold to be putting a timestamp on this at this point.
Yes, Sophia, let me just add on to what Mark said. I think that's wishful thinking, okay? You have to set conditions in order to achieve outcomes, okay? And just saying 2026 or 2027 because it fits your timeline, France, France, Germany, Poland, whatever other countries are involved, that doesn't make it so. It's only so if there's decisive victories on the battlefield. And unless NATO and the United States contributes to those decisive victories, it's not going to occur. So again, that's wishful thinking. And you have to actually do something in order to get something. And right now, doing something, I give the French credit. The French are sold 100 Rafale jet fighters to Ukraine. That's a good thing. But those jet fighters won't be introduced until 2026, 2027 at the earliest. The question is, what are you doing now? Okay, and right now we're missing the now part. Everyone's focused on the future part, thinking that this is going to come to a conclusion when economic sanctions take hold. But the economic sanctions is just one instrument of national power, and alone by itself isn't not going to be successful.
And indeed, in this light, we also know about possible decision, which is not yet taken by the European Council, about using this Russian frozen assets in order to give Ukraine a reparation loan. Do you see the willingness of the EU basically to continue the support? Because Ukrainian governments warned that for the next year, Ukraine probably will not have enough finance to fight. Mark, what's your take on that?
Yeah, we've really, clearly we've reached an inflection point here in terms of the funding of the war. And it all stems to how these frozen funds are going to be used. They thought they had a pathway forward, that they were going to unfreeze them, that they'd be used to fund the war going forward. Belgium balked. Basically, they said, look, we're worried about getting sued after the war. Again, people thinking past the initial problem, the current problem, if you will. But Belgium said it. So the backup plan was, okay, well, what if we do guarantees, but that means taking on more debt? Or what if we just take on more debt in general across the EU? And that's run into obstacles. So there are three different ways. And Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the EU Commission, is basically saying, look, we've got to decide, because not giving Ukraine what it needs to be able to continue to fight this war economically is not acceptable. So I think they'll get there. But at this point, the EU, I think, is wrapping itself into a bind. And part of it is because of different kind of politics. You've got Slovakia. It doesn't want to take on more debt. It doesn't want to see this war continue. Is looking like Orban and Hungary to try to find ways to end it. So they're creating problems. So I suspect what will happen at the end of the day is that you'll probably see some kind of compromise. We don't know yet. Sophia, obviously you yourself have reported extensively from Brussels. But my guess is we'll see some kind of form where these assets get unfrozen. And then certain countries, a coalition of the willing, if you will provide Belgium some type of guarantees that in the future, if there's some kind of suit, that they'll stand by them. But, in my mind, that's the best, easiest way forward, because getting all of the EU to accept more debt may be more problematic in the short term. Time will tell.